Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening potentially, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the Equifax Canada webinar on what the consumer credit freeze means for your business, as well as what it means for consumers and the other stakeholders who are involved. So, quick introduction to the platform before we get started. I'm going to pass over to Sandra to walk us through the housekeeping, and then we'll get rolling with the content. Sandra, over to you.
Thanks so much, Julie, and hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Each area within the On24 platform is responsive, so you can maximize or minimize each widget or box on your screen based on your viewing needs. Our presenters are on camera today in the media player on the left side of your screen, with slides showing in the middle. We'll have a couple of polling questions for you to participate in, so watch out for those. There's an Ask a Question widget underneath the slide area, so feel free to enter any questions you may have, and we'll address them throughout our session today. In the event there's too many questions to get through, we will generate an FAQ document, which we'll send out to you in the coming weeks. Our presentation is available in the Related Content widget for downloading on the left, as well as some other documents you may find pertinent. Today's session is being recorded, and you will receive the on-demand link via email in a couple of weeks, along with a subtitled French recording. Bios of our speakers appear on the right, and some new features today you'll notice is a smiley face widget at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to click on how you're feeling about today's presentation during our session. To the right of that smiley face icon is a Contact Us button. Please send us an email if you'd like further information, and a team member will be happy to help. And today, as an added bonus, we have closed captions available, which you can access from the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. So let's get started. Julie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Appreciate that. All right, I'd like to start by introducing who you're going to be seeing during this webinar over the next hour. That first head in the circle is myself. I'm Julie Kuzmic, and I have a dual mandate at Equifax focused around both consumer advocacy and compliance when it comes to our regulations around consumers. So very lucky to be talking about Bill 53 and the consumer freeze. It beautifully fits in both of my two areas of focus. I'm very honored and privileged to be joined today by a panel of experts across the Equifax business. We have Bethany Gillingham, who is one of our product managers and certainly has her hands more than dirty with getting in there with all the details for the credit freeze. We have Julia Sadkowski, who is our head of legal, vice president of legal and general counsel. And last but certainly not least, we have Karen Zausito, who is a senior delivery manager here at Equifax and very well seasoned with many of our client solutions and the details of Bill 53 or the consumer credit freeze. So I'd like to actually start with a poll here. So you should see this poll coming up on your screen, and we just want to get a sense of how confident you are currently feeling about being able to implement and understand the details around what the credit freeze actually means. So I'd like you to go ahead and select one of these answers, please. You're either feeling so confident you could be giving this webinar, in which case I'd be tempted to pass the mic over to you, but unfortunately this platform we're using doesn't allow it, so you're stuck with me. Or you have a solid, fair, or even a poor level of understanding. No judgment here. I'm going to just give you another couple of seconds to get that response in, your level of confidence around the consumer credit freeze. And let's take a look at what our results are looking like. Well, I guess I don't have very much competition for giving the webinar, so it's a good thing I brought some friends from the office. Looks like we've got a fair, most people are landing in the fair category, which is good to see, but we do have a pretty decent number who are feeling poor and a few feeling solid. So we're really glad that you're all here today, whether you're joining us live or listening to the recording. Our aim is to help increase that level of confidence. So let's get right into it. So let's start with the basics. We are going to talk about the legal details in a minute about how this actually came about and what it is that we're talking about. But before we get there, let's remember that this is actually a consumer protection measure. So this was put into place in order to help consumers. Although I think I'm speaking from experience and you can probably relate, sometimes it may feel like the regulations are put into place to frustrate those of us who have to come up with the solutions for them. But really, the idea here is giving consumers more control over access to their credit data. Of course, we do have the existing capabilities at Equifax. Consumers can put a fraud warning and or an identity alert onto their credit files today. And those mechanisms are intended to help protect people who are concerned about somebody applying for credit in their name. But one of the things that those mechanisms don't prevent is the credit file or the credit report from being shared with the creditor themselves. Depending on which province you are residing in and which province you're doing business in, the obligation on the part of the creditor is either legally binding or highly encouraged, but the onus is on the credit provider, the lender, the credit card issuer, whomever is processing the consumer's application. The onus is on them to see that the consumer has put a fraud alert or an ID warning on their credit report and then take the necessary steps. That's usually calling the phone number that is provided on the file before actually extending the credit. So one of the big things that changes here is actually preventing the transmission of the credit file when the consumer has put their file into a freeze status. And this is where I'm going to ask you, Julia, in your capacity really being in the legal details, can you walk us through the legal framework of what we're actually talking about and what the requirements are with the credit freeze?
Absolutely, Julie. And thanks for that introduction, because I think it's a really important distinction that we consider that there are some protective measures that already exist, some that are requiring requesters of credit file information to act when they see that fraud alert or ID alert on the file. But it's definitely next level to have this new act come in place. So just to get started, I want to start with a housekeeping reminder that a lot of times we use different terms interchangeably and it really means the same thing. So I want to make sure we all stay aligned as to what we're talking about here. So Bill 53 is probably a term you've heard a lot in your day-to-day when thinking about this new law in Quebec. And that is what the bill was titled before it came into force. Now you'll hear it as the Credit Assessment Agents Act, which is its formal name. And during this presentation, we'll refer to it just as the Act. So when you hear Act, Credit Assessment Agents Act, or Bill 53, we're talking about the same piece of legislation that comes out of Quebec. And the other term I want to make sure I flag here is the idea of a credit assessment agent. So Equifax is considered a credit assessment agent, but you probably don't hear that term used a lot by us or within your own industry. You'll probably be more familiar with the idea of a credit agent, a credit bureau, a credit agency, a credit reporting agency. And so we'll try to be consistent and use the term credit agency or credit reporting agency throughout this presentation, but that's when you get these slides later, that's what we're referring to. All those things are the same. So by way of overview, the Credit Assessment Agents Act, or Bill 53, came into force October 28th, 2020, and it applies within the province of Quebec. The intent of this act, as Julie says, does two things. One was that it wants to provide consumers with formalized rights under the act, but it also, its primary reason for existing is to make sure that it is overseeing the supervision and regulation of credit agencies and our commercial practices and the management practices that we have with the very important data that we maintain. Among the different rights that were granted to consumers, this idea of a credit freeze is one, and it's not yet in force. The credit freeze will come into force on February 1st, 2023. And one of the reasons for that delay, whereas the rest of the Act is fully in force, is because this is something that is novel in Canada. This is very different than the fraud alert or ID alert that Julie was speaking to before. This is something very net new, which places requirements on the credit agencies with respect to when we can and cannot deliver credit file information upon request, based on a consumer placing a freeze on their file. The other interesting thing is that this act ties into another act in Quebec, which is the act that governs the privacy, an act respecting the protection of personal information in the private sector, which places additional obligations is dealing with personal information in Quebec when they receive this freeze warning. So again, it highlights different steps that you have to take before you're able to continue your transaction and use the personal information. I want to flag that there because it's very related for credit agencies and data recipients. The specific sections are Section 19 and Section 19.1 of that Act. So what this new framework is really doing is setting up consumers for success to be able to have better control over their information and to help them better protect their data, protect their identities, and prevent fraud. When a consumer has a request to place the freeze on the file, that means that Equifax is prohibited from delivering that file to any requester in certain circumstances. And again, it's going to be coming into force on February 1st. So let's dig in a little bit to what that means from an obligation perspective, just so it's clear to everybody where the obligations lie. Again, the main obligation really does fall with the credit agencies like Equifax. We have to enable a consumer to promptly place, suspend, or remove a credit freeze from their file altogether. And so when a credit freeze is active or placed on the credit file, the credit agency is prohibited from delivering the credit file or products derived from the credit file or any other personal information about the consumer where we have reasonable belief that that requester is going to use it for one of the 5 listed reasons. And we've listed them out here with some bold just so we can make it really clear as to when the prohibition is in place. So if we know that the data is going to be used for extending credit, increasing credit, or entering into a credit contract with the consumer, we're not allowed to deliver the file. Additionally, if that use case is going to be for entering into a long-term contract for a lease of goods, so for example, a car lease, or if there's going to be a contract involving sequential performance for a service provided at a distance, so something like a cell phone contract, the file cannot be delivered if the consumer in Quebec has placed the credit freeze on the file. So where the use is prohibited, there is a positive obligation on the credit agency to notify the requester that there is a credit freeze on the file. So what that means is that the file itself will not be delivered where one of these use cases exists during the request for information from Equifax and there is a freeze on the file. Instead, the requester will receive a message alerting them to the fact that this particular consumer has put a freeze on their file. And it'll be an important indicator for next steps for that data recipient or requester to take. Julie alluded this in her introduction, where she talked about the intent of this legislation being really for consumer advocacy reasons, giving the consumer control over their information. It's really important to put that at the heart of your thinking around this new requirement in the law, that the spirit of this legislation is putting the consumer at the center. It's intending to empower consumers and help them better protect their information and their identities and guard against things like fraud and identity theft. And so when you think of that and put yourself in the consumer's shoes, which we're all consumers, so it should be easy to do, and you think about that expectation of the consumer when they're placing a freeze on the file, their expectations are important. Their expectation is that no credit will be extended in my name until you've confirmed who I am. Until I've suspended or removed that freeze from my file, I don't want you using my credit file information where there could be a detriment to me by enabling a fraudulent activity or action. So it's something that's really important to think about. And again, I know I mentioned this on the first slide that I was showing, but it's really important for the data recipients and people who will be requesting the data to review the Privacy Act in Quebec, Section 19 and 19.1 with their legal counsel representative or privacy team to really understand what does that mean for you. There is a corresponding requirement outside of the Act or Bill 53 that gets placed on the data requester that provides you with steps that you should take and must take before you continue to transact once you've received a freeze message, including taking steps to make sure that that consumer is who they say they are. And again, making sure that they take action to suspend their freeze or remove that freeze before that transaction proceeds. On a final note, again, I just want to reiterate some important information about the rollout of this regulation. So again, the Act itself is already in force, and all of the other consumer rights that have been formalized into that are currently in place for Quebec consumers, but the credit freeze, even though it is passed into law, is not yet in force. So on February 1st, 2023, that's the key date, that is when Equifax is going to extend the freeze capability to all Quebec residents in accordance with the Act. What that means is that we are building that freeze functionality so that any company, no matter where you are located in Canada, if you are requesting credit file information from a resident of Quebec, you will have the ability to ingest that freeze, receive that freeze, if that consumer in Quebec has placed a freeze on that file. And there's just a side note that I'm sure Bethany might talk a little bit more about is that the way that Equifax itself has built that freeze is that if this requirement is at some point expanded outside of Quebec, we've built it in a way to have minimal impact on a future implementation if it becomes a legal requirement and that ability gets expanded to Canadians in other jurisdictions. Back to you, Julie. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it would be an understatement to say that answers my question. That was an excellent overview. And I love your comment about putting ourselves in the shoes of the consumers or remembering that we all are consumers as well. I've started out some presentations before, back in the before times when we were allowed to be in front of live audiences, and asked people, can anyone name a consumer? Does anyone here know any consumers? And watched everyone kind of look around at each other like, is this a trick question? I don't know if I know any consumers. So good reminder, we are in fact all consumers. So I think from the consumer standpoint a lot, given my role, when I think about the changes that this act is requiring. But of course, there are a number of stakeholders who are involved who need to make changes and recognize how they need to accommodate the requirements of this act in their day-to-day business. So Bethany, I'm going to look to you next. If you can walk us through the different stakeholders and what their some of their key responsibilities might be. Thank you.
Sure, Julie. So as we've already talked about, consumers are one of the key stakeholders. We're all consumers, and consumers are our customers. So one of the key components of the regulation is the ability for a consumer to apply a freeze to their file, to suspend it for a short period of time, or to remove it if they feel that it's not appropriate for them at this time. And they will be able to do that by interacting with Equifax and other credit bureaus to place that. The next stakeholder is the credit agencies, or the credit reporting agencies, as we're commonly called. And the mandate is on us to be able to promptly deliver this and to allow our systems to ingest the credit freeze from a consumer and then pass it on to our customers like the lenders. And then lenders have the obligation to share with us what they'll be using their credit files for and to be able to ingest the credit freeze. So if it is exempt use case, which we'll get into in the next slide, they would be able to still see the credit file. And if it's not, it would be restricted, and there would be a message letting them know that it had not been received and that there was a credit freeze on the file.
Okay, so let's start digging into use cases. Julia walked us through the fact that there are different scenarios where this obligation may be exempt. So these are actually defined by the regulatory body, which is the AMF in Quebec. Unfortunately, it's not our decision at Equifax to make about what is or isn't an exempt use case. So Bethany, back over to you to walk us through what that landscape looks like.
Sure, Julie. So as Julia mentioned earlier, Section 9 of the Act is very clear about what is exempt or what is non-exempt. So extending credit, increasing credit, a long-term lease such as a car lease, or sequential performance like a cell phone or some other telcos will fall into that scenario too. It is less clear on what is exempt, so we can infer based on what is non-exempt, what would be exempt. So things like government services are exempt or applying for social assistance, any attempt to collect or get repayment. So for example, a student loan issuance would be non-exempt, but once the student graduates and you're collecting on the loan, that would be exempt. There was a little bit of lack of clarity involving tenants and rentals, but we've determined that that is exempt. So if I apply for a mortgage, that would be a non-exempt use case, but applying as a tenant for an apartment would be exempt, because the intent of the Act is not to slow down the process, but it's just to protect customers from fraudulent activities. And one thing that we've gotten questions on in the past is about restructuring debt, but because the agreement has already been made to issue the debt, collecting the debt is as an exempt purpose as well. I hope that answers your question, Julie.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of information here to absorb. Now, one of the other angles that we need to think about is the clients of Equifax who are consuming the credit files. They need to understand what changes they're going to see in the actual data as it is coming in from Equifax. So Karen, you're up next. I'm going to ask you to walk us through the solution for online or real-time credit file requests. What does that look like? Karen, it's possible that you are still on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. So
gotta
yes,
go back, start again.
Okay, of course. Happy to explain all the impacts to everyone. All of our STS customers will need to make a change in their application connecting to Equifax to ensure they can receive and handle the new freeze indicator hit code 7 in the designator code field on the header segment. Value 7 is a new value provided back on an existing field that we have today. Your technical team might also know this existing field as the hit code field. The existing values are from 1 to 6, where 1 is a hit, 2 is a no hit, and we are adding a new value 7 for the frozen credit files. Once your system has been receiving the hit code 7, you should adapt your internal business processes in consultations with your legal teams to determine the action to be taken when the credit file is frozen. There are a few very useful documentations that can help your development teams. The first one is the Quebec Bill 53 Consumer Credit Freeze Guidelines. It contains the use cases and the code samples. And the second one is the 2022 version of the STS user guide in both full file fix and XML versions. Both have been updated to include the Bill 53 credit file informations. And the last one is the test files. The test files will be available on the Equifax development web portals for you to download, or you can get them from your delivery managers or our support teams upon request. All right, so now let's take a look at some of the examples. In a non-exempt scenario, where you will be getting back a hit code indicator without a credit file, it looks like this on the left for full file fix. Hit code 7 is highlighted in the sample. If you're getting a print image, the print image file will display a message instead of the actual report. On the right side of the slide, you can see the code samples for an XML response. Again, the hit code 7 field in the header section has been highlighted. It doesn't matter if you're using full file fix or XML, you will need to map the result to your user interface. And each lender will need to come up with your own messaging in your system to talk to your consumers about the freeze. Now let's take a look at the exam scenario. In the exam scenario, where you will be getting back the hit code indicator in the header segment to let you know that the credit file has a freeze on it, and at the same time, the credit file and any subscribed scoring product will also be returned. In addition, if you subscribe to the consumer statement or consumer declaration section, you will see an added warning message in the consumer declaration section, letting you know that credit file is frozen. If you don't subscribe to this feature, your agent will not be able to see the message on the credit file. In the full file fix example on the left, you will see the hit code 7 is being returned, highlighted in yellow, and in the consumer declaration section below, also highlighted in yellow, you will see the sample warning message regarding the credit freeze. Please note that the exact message content is subject to change. On the right side of the slide, you will see the similar example in XML format. Again, hit code 7 is returned, and so is the consumer declaration warning. In between the two sections, it is the regular credit file content because exempt, so the credit file and the scores will be returned. All these examples I just talked about are documented in the Bill 53 Consumer Credit Freeze Guidelines. So please refer to that documentation if you need additional information. Okay, so now let's take a look at iDecision. Here is a standard non-exempt output if you have subscribed to iDecision. When polling a consumer credit file that is frozen, the hit code in the header will return value 7. And in the iDecision specific score segment, you will be returned with a brand new reject code B7 along with narratives. If you're using the web portal version of the iDecision, you will see the same reject code and the narratives being displayed on the screen. At this time, there is no exempt use cases going through iDecision, so there's no exempt examples we will be providing here. For additional details, we will also have the iDecision Bill 53 API guide that will be made available on the Equifax Development web portal. Julie, back to you.
Wow, Karen, that's some really serious detail. That was a lot of XML on the screen there. I'm glad that you highlighted that reference information is available for download from the Equifax reference website. So that was really good coverage for our online or real-time data transmission. But what about offline batch and some of the other products that our customers may be using? Of course, many of our clients at Equifax are using other Equifax solutions in addition to just the pure credit data. So Karen, calling on you again to walk us through those other solutions.
Of course. Let's start off with the offline batch product. So the offline batch product, which is something many of our customers have at Equifax, and you're probably curious to know what is going to happen to your offline runs. At Equifax, we classify majority of our offline batch runs to be exempt because they're considered to be for account management and monitoring or portfolio review purposes. This means, by default, all of your offline runs for our customers will stay status quo with no changes. No freeze flag will be returned on the offline runs, just like how it is today. If for any reason you are using your exempt offline runs for adjudication, upsell, cross-sell, or to extend credit and the services, then please contact Equifax for a custom solution. There are very limited and very specific use cases we have for non-exempt purpose in the offline world. We have already identified these potential non-exempt offline customers and have contacted the Equifax account executive for these offline customers. Our delivery managers will be working with the non-exempt offline customers to deliver the freeze flag in those offline, non-exempt offline runs. If you believe your offline runs should be classified as non-exempt, please contact Equifax for further discussion. So in summary, if we have not reached out to you and discussed with you about your offline runs. Your offline runs are most likely exempt, and you should not be using the offline runs to extend credit in any way because it does not have the Bill 53 freeze information on them. Okay, so let's move on to other solutions at the Equifax. If you are using the Equifax web portal, no coding changes will be required since we will be displaying the message on the screen to inform you there is a freeze on the credit file. If you're using iDecision, as I mentioned earlier, please refer to the iDecision Bill 53 API guide that will be made available on the Equifax development web portals. If you're one of our interconnect customers, most likely your delivery managers has already discussed the Bill 53 with you and booked the impact analysis walkthrough with your development team already. You'll be working with your interconnect delivery managers on this. If you're using Business Connect, a separate guide will be made available for you by Equifax account executives and delivery managers. They are already working on reaching out to you. And lastly, the fraud products such as EID, AML, and the Citadel. Standalone EID, AML, and the Citadel posts are 100% exempt, and we're expecting no changes to these output for this product. However, if you're getting a credit report along with AML or Citadel, for example, then the exemptions for the credit file is based on the purpose of the credit file usage. If the inquiry is for non-exempt purposes, then you will be returned with the hit code 7 with no credit files, while the AML or Citadel output will continue to return as usual, since these products are exempt. So you should still evaluate if your system can handle the new hit code 7 in these scenarios. So at this point, you're probably really want to know, how do you technically tell Equifax that some of your transactions are exempt or some of your transactions are not exempt on your system-to-system request to Equifax? By default, all member numbers that request for credit file products are non-exempt, except for member numbers that have industry code in insurance or collections. If your insurance or collection business is using a member number that does not have the right industry code on them, then these member numbers are not exempt. So please speak to Equifax if that's the case. Equifax is also providing you with two options to make your transactions exempt. You can use either one or both for different scenarios, whichever one that will make your life easier in adapting Bill 53 changes. The first option is to set up the member number to be exempt. We can activate a rule on the member number to mark your member number to be exempt. Once the member number has been set up to be exempt, every single transaction going through the member number will return hit code 7 along with the credit file and the other subscribed products. This option can be activated on existing or new member numbers and could be done on a soft or hard inquiry member numbers, since being Bill 53 exempt is completely independent from whether the inquiry is hard or soft. To activate this option on your member number, please contact Equifax. The second option is to send Equifax an exempt indicator on the input to mark the transactions to be for exempt purpose. This option could be especially useful when requesting a credit file on a multi-purpose member number. So for example, sometimes the member number is used for account openings, which is exempt, and sometimes the same member number could be used for credit card or loan offerings, which is not exempt. So being able to dynamically tell Equifax about the exemption needs on the fly will make your solutioning much easier. What you see on the slide right here are the positions of the new input field on various versions of the Equifax input format. By default, if the field is left empty and the member number is not marked as exempt, then the transaction will be treated as non-exempt use case. We're still working on updating the STS user guide for the second option. We expect to update the Equifax web portal with the most updated user guide at the end of the month. Back to you, Julie.
Wow, Karen, that was a lot of detail. Thank you very much for walking us through all of those different scenarios. I'd like to change gears now and talk about timelines. So Julia mentioned that the actual requirement goes live in February, but we all know that there's a lot of work that is required between now and then in order to make sure that we all have our systems work and our procedures in place in order to handle this new requirement. So Bethany, I'm going to ask you to walk us through the timeline, please.
Sure thing, Julie. So I'm sure to many of us, it feels like we've been talking about this for quite a long time since it did start. It was announced in the fall of 2021. So since that time, Equifax has been working on development, and we've already started working with many of you to answer your questions and provide you with some information. So we're continuing to do that, and the parts that affect you are largely done. Starting September, you will be able to begin testing in your UAT environment. We're not expecting it will be terribly onerous. It should work fairly smoothly, and we're giving quite a lot of lead time. So we're going to deploy it into production, hopefully in December of 2022. We want to be sensitive to things like code freezes that you all likely have and that we have as well. And we want to have enough of a buffer if for some reason there was some unforeseen bug or glitch, we would have a little bit of lead time. So we shouldn't have to do any development in the new year. That will be reserved for our internal development to make sure that it's available for our customer facing. So if we deploy it on, let's say, December 2nd, for argument's sake, it would be ready to go, but we will not offer consumers the option to put a freeze on their file until February 1st. So it basically just sit there waiting for 2 months until consumers are able to start requesting the freeze. But we're hoping this is a good amount of lead time to give everyone time to test and code and come back to us with any questions that they may have, and have everything ready to go in time to make the regulators very happy with us. So.
Yes, emphasis on making the regulators very happy with us. Thanks for that walkthrough, Bethany. So we wanted to make sure that we left a lot of time during this webinar for questions. We know we've seen them coming in. We know that there are a lot of clarifications that people are looking for. So we're going to get there in just a moment, but I'm going to ask for your participation one more time before we get there. And that is to answer a very similar question to the one that you already answered earlier on in this presentation. And that is, what is your understanding now about the credit freeze and how it will be implemented? We'd like to get a sense of whether you have gained some more knowledge and confidence from this material that we have covered so far. So please do go ahead and choose one of these answers. I'm very interested to get a sense of my own job security by seeing how many people feel that they could be giving this webinar. May need to go polish up my resume a bit after this. That's more about me than you. So give us an indication. Where do you sit now? Are you still feeling a bit unclear on how the pieces fit together for the consumer credit freeze? Are you still at a poor? Hopefully we're going to see a bit of movement up to fair, even more confidence at solid. Or are you looking to just knock me right out of my seat? Which I can accept if that's the case. So I'll just give you another minute. And when I say minute, I really mean about 4 seconds to get that answer submitted. And let's go ahead and see how successful this webinar has been. Okay, my job still looks okay. Obviously, that's of great concern to me. It looks like I'm okay at 1.3%. But I'm really happy to see we seem to have bumped everybody out of the poor category. This wasn't even staged. This was real. So that's very satisfying for us on the panel to see that you are gaining more confidence in what you need to know in order to implement these requirements. So I'm going to move on to our information and resources slide. We've referenced this a bit during the time that we've been talking, that all of those code samples that Karen was walking through, you didn't need to be taking screenshots, although of course you can download the PDF of this presentation. But you can see here where you can go to find more information as you need it. And while we keep this up on the screen, I'd like to start addressing some of the questions that have come in. We've seen some really good questions, obviously a lot of engagement on this topic. So Bethany, I'm going to start with you. Some people are wondering about whether or not consumers will be charged for the ability to freeze or unfreeze their credit file. So over to you on that answer, please.
Sure, and I can give you a two-part answer on that. So the regulation allows us to charge both consumers and customers. So there will be a charge to a consumer. So if my mom wants to put a freeze on the file, she would be able to do that for a small charge. And there will also be a new product code that will go out to all of our customers. So if a customer or if a consumer forgets to take the freeze off and applies for a credit card, you might see a new charge on your invoice. The charge will be similar to what you pay for a no-hit, and there'll be a new product code as well. So we're not anticipating there will be that many, and we're going to try to make the education very, very clear for consumers about that. But there will be a charge for both consumers and customers.
Thank you for that. Another one for you, Bethany, and this is related to the inquiries, which of course we at Equifax do have that legislated requirement to keep a record on the credit file every time it has been accessed. And this is what we all know, fondly or otherwise, as inquiries, hard and soft inquiries on the credit files. So the question here is whether or not inquiries will be posted on the consumer's credit file during that time that their file is frozen. So if there is an attempted access to the file, will an inquiry be posted, Bethany?
That's a really great question, Julie. So the current inquiry types now, there's the hard, which is derogatory, and the soft, which is non-derogatory. And those are for a request and a successful delivery of the credit file. Because this is only an attempt, we will not be placing an inquiry on the file. They will, however, be logged though. So if we're ever audited or if there's any kind of consumer or customer dispute, we will be able to go into the logs to see them, but there will not be an inquiry like the type you or the consumer see right now on their credit report.
All right, thank you for that explanation. Let's go a little more technical. So Karen, I'm going to look to you to answer this one. And this is related to the Equifax member numbers. So could a member number be used for multiple purposes and still be exempt in the real-time online environment?
If a customer uses one member number for multiple purposes, for example, one branch has one shared member number for all purposes, then the member number is not exempt. The customer will either have to get a new member number for exempt use cases and another member number for non-exempt use cases to provide it, or when they're sending the request to Equifax, they could send us the indicator, the exempt indicator on the input to tell Equifax that use case is exempt. But by default, the multi-purpose member number is not exempt.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. We've got a legal one for you, Julia, so get ready to unmute yourself, please. This is a question about whether Equifax is being more strict than the regulations actually require.
No, we're not. So again, the regulations that have come out are quite clear in terms of inside the Act itself. It expressly states what Equifax is required to do and when we are prohibited from delivering a credit file if there is a freeze on the file. So we actually use the wording that is directly in the English translation of the Act during this presentation where we describe those use cases. And in the French, we'll use the exact wording that is in the legislation to describe those use cases. Those are the instances where we are prohibited from delivering a credit file, and any other use case, the file can still be delivered. So again, that's exactly what the freeze is protecting. It's extending credit, increasing credit, entering into a credit contract, entering into a long-term lease for goods, and entering into a contract for sequential performance services performed at a distance. And that's how we're judging the use cases. If it fits in those buckets, that's when we will deliver the freeze message and not the file. And in any other case, we'll deliver the file. So we take our role very seriously, but we also view ourselves as someone who has to balance both the needs of the consumer and the needs of business. We want to be fair and equitable in the way that we manage our data. And that's what we strive to do. So I would say we are just aligning to the law as it's.
All right. Thank you for that detailed answer. Bethany, I'm going to go back to you, and there have been a few questions around a similar theme, which is, what if somebody doesn't live in Quebec and tries to put a freeze on their file? Or what if somebody has more than one address? So they might have one address that's in Quebec and another outside Quebec, or another scenario would be somebody moving. So you had somebody who lived in Quebec and now they moved to a different province, and they had a freeze on their file at the time they moved. What would happen in that situation? So I know I just asked you about 4 different questions there, but hoping that you can walk us through what that whole landscape looks like from the consumer's experience.
Sure thing, Julie. And that's one of those things. It seems easy. Where do you live? But it's one of those questions that when you really think about it, it can get a little bit complicated. So in order for a consumer to place a freeze on the file, they would need to have a current address of Quebec. So occasionally we'll see a situation where maybe a consumer remembers to update their credit card because that's something that gets mailed to them. They move out of Quebec, they update that account, but they forget to update their cell phone address because they don't get any mail. It just slips their mind. So the address can flip back and forth. That's one example that you alluded to. So as long as the consumer's primary address is Quebec, they will be able to place a freeze. If it changes, either because it's flipping between 2 addresses or they move, we will allow the consumer to retain the freeze on the file, and they will still be able to suspend it or maintain it. But if they decide to remove it at some point, then they would no longer be eligible to reapply it. So it'd be similar to having something like a grandfathered bank account or cell phone plan where you are able to access something because it's already in your account. If a consumer left the province and fully removed the freeze, they would not be able to reapply the freeze unless legislation changed or they were to move back to Quebec. So you may see, our customers may see some customers who don't technically live in Quebec but have the freeze, and that's why is we don't want to be taking it off somebody who has a legitimate reason for wanting it on, and just, to benefit the consumer so they're not disappointed if they lose the product.
Okay, and somewhat related to that, along the same lines as the consumer experience, is there an amount of time that the freeze stays on? So does it stay for 30 or 60 days and automatically come off, or how does that look from the consumer's side of things?
So the freeze would stay on indefinitely. So hypothetically, a consumer could put it on their 18th birthday and it would remain on for the rest of their lives. We don't anticipate most consumers will do that. Maybe they'll put it on for a period of time, and that's why the suspension is offered. So, for example, I have a freeze on my account because I'm concerned about identity theft and I'm a Quebec resident. So I could say, oh, you know what? I wanted to go get a new car this weekend. I'm going to suspend my freeze so I know I'll be able to get the loan to go through, and then the suspension will automatically expire. But especially some people may want to have it, for an elderly parent or grandparent or relative, you would put it on and it would remain on their file until you have to actively remove it. There's no expiry or purge date.
Gotcha. Thank you for walking us through that. Karen, we've got a slightly more technical question, and I know you covered this really well during your section, but maybe we can just have a little more of a high-level description here. So we do have a couple of questions around the specifics of what actually gets returned. If there is a freeze on the file and the Equifax customer sends in that request to Equifax requesting that credit file, what is actually going to be sent back? Is it an empty file with the freeze indicator, or what will that look like from the recipient's standpoint?
Yeah, of course. So if it is a non-exempt purpose, you will be getting back the hit code 7 with no credit files. So it's I wouldn't say it's an empty credit file. You just wouldn't see any credit files attached to the output. So you will see the hit code 7 in the header segment, and the credit file section will not be there. Does that answer the question?
It does for me, so thank you for that. I'd like to go back to Julia, actually, for a bit of a legal clarification. So we have had a question around how Equifax decided which of the use cases are exempt or non-exempt. So Julia, can you walk us through what goes on, or what went on, I guess, behind the scenes in order to come up with that exempt, non-exempt list?
Sure. So again, when we were taking a look at what is exempt and what is non-exempt, we referred back specifically to the legislation. Since the legislation expressly lists the instances where a credit file can't be delivered, we would go first to that list. So we'd look at the use case and say, okay, so what is the purpose of the data recipient receiving this data? How are they going to use it? And then once we knew how they were going to use it, we measured that against the prohibited use cases. And if it fit into what is prohibited, then it went into the non-exempt bucket. And then if it was outside of that, it went into the exempt bucket. And so we tried to look at all the use cases and gather all the use cases that we are aware of based on our different types of accesses and how we have been tracking access and use case types. And of course, sometimes you're going to get some items that are bundled together, which will have to be decoupled, because again, if there is within a use case something that's prohibited, we're not allowed to deliver the file. And of course, if there's ever any question by us whether or not something clearly fits within a use case, we can always go and ask the regulator for how they will be interpreting it. We haven't gotten there yet in terms of any use cases that we thought weren't clear, because the legislation is quite clear in terms of when we are prohibited from delivering a file.
Okay, thank you for that. And a follow-on question, a very specific one, is around a soft credit check for a pre-approval for a credit card, I think. I just want to make sure that I'm getting that question right. So is a soft credit check for a credit card pre-approval, would that be considered an exempt, one of the exempt use cases, or otherwise?
So I think the first thing that is important for everybody on this call to understand is that the inquiry type is not relevant to whether or not we are allowed per the Act in Quebec to deliver the credit file. So I'm just going to give a high-level recap as to an inquiry posting. So what the law says in all the jurisdictions is that Equifax is required to post a notation to file or inquiry to the file every time that the credit file is accessed. But what the law doesn't say is what has to be soft or what has to be hard. Our obligation there is just to be fair and consistent. So you can't, provide one use case is soft to one customer, but enable it as hard to another customer. That can't happen. Soft inquiries are visible only to the consumer and will not impact credit, whereas the hard inquiries, as we all know, are visible to any authorized recipient of the file and may impact credit. But again, that is completely separate and distinct from the idea of the credit freeze and what is allowed and what is not allowed. So when you are talking about a pre-qualification for a credit card, if you are providing the consumer solely with a quote or an actionable quote that they can then pursue, that you're not actually making a credit decision, you're not actually extending credit or increasing credit or entering into a credit contract by providing that quote, then it is under the Act exempt. But again, if that is coupled with a transaction where you can't separate out your credit decision from that quote, it will not be exempt.
All right. Thank you, Julia. That's very helpful. I just want to mention that we have had some comments that some people have been having issues with the links that you're seeing through the platform. So if you refresh your browser, those issues should have been resolved. So feel free to just hit refresh in order to see those links. Hopefully they should be working a little bit better. But of course, let us know if you are still having issues. And moving straight on to the next question. Bethany, I wanted to check in with you. There are a few questions around the difference between suspending a credit freeze and removing a credit freeze. So I'm wondering if we can give a quick compare and contrast the difference between suspend and remove. And there are also some questions around timeframes. So if a consumer submits to Equifax a request to suspend or remove their credit freeze, what will the turnaround time look like before that credit file is now unfrozen and accessible to Equifax clients?
Sure, Julie. So the first part of it, I'll answer the middle part first. So it should be pretty close to near time. So if I either am interacting with the My Equifax portal as a consumer, or I call 1-800-Equifax to put a freeze on my file, it should be very close to real time, within a few seconds, hopefully. So if, for example, I'm sitting in my car dealership or my bank and I say, oh, shoot, I forgot to unfreeze my credit file, I will be able to do that. And the financial professional I'm working with should be able to resubmit the application, within a few seconds or a moment. The difference between suspend and remove is the permanence. So the freeze is sort of at this time. So I could apply a freeze today, and then I could say, oh, you know what, this doesn't work for me right now, I'm going to remove it. So it's only for that time period. So when I suspend it, it would be for a predetermined short period of time. We're still determining that, but it'll probably be something like 48 hours. So I know that I'm going to get a new cell phone this weekend. So on, Friday morning, I log in, I put a freeze on my file, and I know it will be, I put a suspension on my file. So for 48 hours, I can apply for credit as I normally could before the freeze. Once the 48 hours expires, the freeze would go back on. So it's to give consumers a bit of time to go and apply for that loan or apply for that new cell phone account or work with their mortgage broker. And then it will automatically time out, kind of like when you press pause back in the day on a VHS, it would automatically start playing again after 5 minutes. Removing it is more permanent. So when you remove it, it's gone, it's done, there's no more freeze. So going forward, your file would be readily available just like it is today, and you could choose to put it on again in the future. So maybe somebody would remove it when they're planning to buy a house because they know they're going to be in and out of the bank all summer and they don't want the friction, or they decide it's not right for their lifestyle to have a credit freeze on, or they could put a credit freeze on and they could keep suspending it every weekend that they go to the bank to talk about renewing their mortgage. So there's a lot of options for the consumer as to how they interact with it.
And can you just confirm the cost situation? So if somebody is suspending versus ending a freeze, would there be a difference in the cost for the individual?
No, the cost is only to apply the freeze for the first time or subsequent times. So there's no charge to suspend and there's no charge to remove. But if a consumer chose to remove it and then maybe in 6 months or a year they want to reapply it, they could be subject to a new charge for that.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. We've had so many good questions come in, and I really hope that we've been able to get a lot of those burning questions addressed. Unfortunately, we do have more questions than we can actually get to, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. Many of us have meetings starting in the next couple of minutes. So I do want to remind you, you can download a copy of the presentation materials directly through the platform. You can find them on the webinar login page, along with links to our Bill 53 or Credit Assessment Agents Act or Consumer Freeze, however you want to call it. The information webpage is there. Also, links to both English and French subtitled recordings of this webinar will be sent out to you within the next couple of weeks. That'll be coming by email, so you can keep an eye out for those to be arriving in your inbox. And finally, I would request that you take a moment to complete the brief survey at the end of this webinar. That's very helpful for us to get some feedback. And the very last thing I would like to do, but very important, is to thank all the panelists for their help and explanation and background and experience today. This has certainly been very enlightening for me, and we very much hope that this has been helpful for the audience as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.